Hello and welcome back to GI Sprint, a special series of video panels, podcasts and articles exploring how game developers can combat the rising costs of development by making games faster, better and cheaper. We're going to be talking about a range of subjects over the coming week, or the past week, or wherever this falls in the running order. And these will be available as write-ups and tips you can read on GamesIndustry.biz. And I've got other plans to release in this podcast and video, so there's plenty of ways to kind of get learnings from these. We've got an interesting topic for today. First of all, I should introduce myself. I am James Batchelor, Editor-in-Chief of GamesIndustry.biz. We're going to be talking about how AI can accelerate development, and specifically the development process itself. So this is not necessarily going to be talking about what AI can do within games to kind of create new experiences for players. This can be talking about how AI can help developers speed up what they're doing, accelerate, kind of remove some of the drudgery and you know, kind of the grind work, and get a bit more time for the creativity, hopefully. I have a panel of experts with me, and I'm going to introduce them kind of one by one, ask them to kind of tell us a little bit about themselves. So we're going to start with Lucie. Could you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Lucie. I am currently a senior producer at Mighty Build and Test, a keyword studio down in headquartered in Australia. I've been with them for about a year now, working with Lauren. In terms of my relationship with AI, I am pretty much in the camp of newbies. Being dubbed an expert is a bit new to me, so yeah, I'm curious. And you know, I've got some opinions, probably like a lot of people, and keen to see where the discussion goes.
Lovely, thank you. Lauren.
Yeah, hi. So my name's Lauren. I'm a director of production at Mighty Build and Test. We are a AI and automation studio mostly focused on quality assurance and testing of games. So there's a whole bunch of different technologies we work with, from image recognition to machine learning, all sorts of different things, always kind of investigating what new opportunities are out there for automation and restoring back developers' time. Yeah, it's a little bit of what we do, and I work across a whole different suite of team members, just trying to keep things on track and get our heads around everything.
Thank you. Aleena, tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm Aleena Chia, and I am a lecturer in media and communications based at Goldsmiths in London. And I've been studying game developers and how they automate different processes. So, even before, this boom with generative AI, it was procedural content generation. And one of the things that I'm interested in is, in the process of automation, what kinds of things about creativity changes? How do we interpret what is creative differently in these sorts of processes? And happy to be here, happy to talk more about the sort of factors at play when people decide, when studios decide, or when indie devs decide whether or not they want to automate, and also what happens at the end of these processes, or as implications of these processes, because they have all sorts of knock-on effects in terms of how folks get trained up, but also in terms of what the industry is going to look like.
Nice. Sean.
Yeah, hi. So I've been in the games industry for over 5 decades. Well, spanning 5 decades, from the 80s through to now. I've played key roles in some very well-known games. I quickly moved on to helping game developers, and now we've developed a character pipeline that has a lot of AI systems in it, automation, from the creation of characters to the variation of characters, and also the verification, i.e. checking that these characters are actually valid without any human interaction. So I've joined a company called Didimo 2 years ago. We have a product called Populate. Not only does it generate characters, it also gives you the ability to render a vast amount of them in crowd simulations. And we're helping games companies, or should I say we're partnering with games companies to help them achieve their goals in character development in their character pipelines.
Nice. Thank you. And finally, Tommy.
Yeah, so I'm Tommy Thompson. I'm the director of AI in Games, which is a consultancy business that works with game developers across the sector, from the smallest of indies to the biggest of AAAs, on how to interface with and adopt AI technologies as part of the game development process. I have worked in AI for video games now for actually 20 years, I realised recently, which was a bit of a terrifying thought. I am a lapsed academic. I have a PhD in AI for video games, so I am a doctor of AI for video games long before anyone cared. So that was about 15 years ago. And I previously was a university lecturer and researcher. And to the wider world, I'm actually largely known as a content creator. I write the AI in Games Substack over at AIingames.com, as well as host the AI in Games YouTube channel, which has now been going for over 10 years. Oh boy.
Nice. So we've proven there that we've got an excellent panel of experts here. So I'm going to start hurling questions at you, if I may. Then quite a broad one to begin with. I'd like to talk about examples of how AI can be used to streamline the development process. Whenever anyone talks about AI in the last couple of years, particularly generative AI, your thought goes to ChatGPT, Midjourney, things like this that are used to create kind of content. But are there other ways that AI can be used to help improve the efficiencies of how video games are actually made?
I would start by actually clarifying that, particularly I think in the general public and the larger, broader discussion, is that AI is new to this space, which is far from the truth at all. I often talk about we've had a silent revolution in the video games industry over the past decade, really dating back as far as the late 2000s, when we started trying to think about how to use machine learning technologies, which are the broader spectrum within which generative AI exists within. We're trying to build systems that learn from data and then utilize that data in interesting ways. Like Lauren, for example, mentioned image recognition, which is an application area of machine learning, where we have to use a collection of data to learn what images look like such that we can then catch that later. So over the past decade, we've seen a lot of this happen already, where the boom of deep learning, which probably most people will know of for things like the StarCraft AlphaStar bot, which was able to defeat professional StarCraft 2 players. That was actually a really bad example of how it is typically used in video games. It's not really reflective of the production process. But we've seen different ways to take those ideas and apply it in a variety of contexts, whether it's animation blending, cheat detection, image upscaling, image recognition, quality assurance purposes, toxicity checks. So there's a lot of cheat detection and foul behavior in online games, sadly, which has to be accounted for, but also in a lot of other areas that players actually feel as part of their gameplay experience. So I think it's really critical to say, just before we even get into specific application areas, that we've been doing this for a very long time. And it's interesting now that because this is often something that players and even sometimes the broader industry don't know about, because it often happens in higher AAA spaces, it's only now that really, as generative AI has been in such the broader public conversation, that we're actually having to come out and go, no, we've actually been doing this for a little while now.
Well, I think we've been doing it since the 80s, right? So the 80s and the 90s, but most of it was in-house, right? So I think the company that I started off in Bullfrog, we used to create AI players, right? Now a little bit more sophisticated than the ones that we would ship with. And what we did with them is we could run the game really quickly and complete levels in a very quick way without any human intervention. I think if you go back to Populous, right, 1989, that had a computer player in it that was not shipped, right? It was merely there to iterate through the game really quickly. So it's, I can think of countless automations and AI that we've used since the 80s, right? And now we're starting to talk about it and starting to worry about it. But it's always been there. It's been there since the 80s, right? And it puts people out of jobs, right? From things like we don't need tester to test the game, or we need less people to test the game in order to get to the goal that we need to get to. So I think, I can't see why people are so worried now, having, just thinking about what Tommy said about that this has always been here, right? And it's always allowed us to do things greater, because we can't afford to hire the staff, and therefore we write these automation systems, loosely AI, that can help us achieve our goals and raise our quality bar where we wouldn't have the money to do so.
I mean, I think part of what Tommy just said as well about this being a AAA technology space traditionally really resonates, where partly this isn't or hasn't been historically a terribly sexy sort of area. It's not a player-facing area. It's not something that you'd turn into any sort of commercial materials, even to investors, perhaps. These are very much tools that would have traditionally been within the studio, maintained by senior engineering and leveraged by every team member, and perhaps iterated on game release after game release rather than just within the span of that single title. But I think as everybody has, been grappling with the scale of games getting bigger, or, teams wanting to be more ambitious whilst keeping that kind of small indie vibe, having these healthy conversations about how automation tools and AI can both be leveraged, I think is really key. And it's a very interesting space once you sort of peel back the skin of it.
Right, and I think it's a really important difference that's already been brought up by Sean and Lauren, that how when these tools become in a way appified, they move from the studio, they move as things which are constantly iterated, which are adapted to people's pipelines, to becoming a product in an app marketplace, and the combination of how these interoperate with game engines at different levels. These are all questions that we've been grappling with even beyond games, thinking about the platformization of creating culture. What is that going to look like? What is homogenization going to look like in comparison to, or in balance to, efficiency gains? All these are new questions that we need to ask, in addition to, the kinds of data that are being used. In the games industry, for example, the data needs to be quite specific as compared to all these sorts of consumer-facing tools that we see all this hype about right now. So, a lot of moving parts, and I think that the way that we frame this, the way that Tommy has come in and said, there's a longer trajectory, but also a wide range of different use cases of AI, makes the question, rather pointed right now. What is the difference that makes a difference, right? That is bringing these sorts of technologies together in this moment, and how are efficiencies, as well as biases of scale coming into play, and how will game studios as well as other kinds of games practitioners, how will they struggle, and try to do their thing better, faster, cheaper. So,
yeah, but isn't the interjection of some of this stuff because what investors are starting to see, like they saw with the metaverse and VR and stuff, is that if you just write the two letters AI at the beginning of your title of a product, that you're likely to get better investment from it, even if it's not AI and it's just automation, right? So I think they're productizing it through interest, through investment, right? And we've seen that on our end. They're excited by it. Games plus AI, it creates a lot of excitement in people that have this money, and I think that's what's driving some of these. That they're productizing it because they can make money from it, and I think it's definitely a future in that.
Though I would add to that, I actually think this also doesn't help with the current state of the industry, because we've got everybody, AI throwing money at it and whatever else, and it's already, as I said already, the conversation is rather diluted. We don't really get to have a nuanced conversation about the adoption of AI for video games, and according to the general populace, AI's bit like generative AI is the new thing, and it's we've just started putting AI into our production practices in the last 6 months. It's like, no, we've been doing this machine learning for at least 10 to 15 years, symbolic AI going back as far as the 80s, heck, probably even some very basic machine learning as far back as the 80s as well. But the problem is that we continue to have this conversation about AI for video games, which is often being led by people who don't work in games and are often trying to sell an AI product. And I think that is not only warping the conversation, particularly among the player base and the general public, but it's also warping those perceptions internally within the industry. I mean, that's certainly the experience I'm having chatting with a lot of studios, because they're hearing the sound bites about GPT and everything else and going, can we do that in our games? I'm like, well, yeah, but no. And is this legal? Like, whoo, that's another question. Let's come back to that later. And so I feel like as great as it is that AI is in a boom in some regards, because it is actually leading to a lot of meaningful applications and deep research that's actually leading us to advance the state of the art. We're also at that point of the productization of it, which is actually running risk of the enshittification. I get to use that word in a podcast. I'm so happy of every technical pipeline that's out there.
I just think it's really super interesting, this AI discussion that's going on at the moment, because it just makes my life easier. It raises my quality bar. It helps me do the things that I couldn't do, right? I couldn't have done before, and I certainly wouldn't have the budget for the game to employ the 10 people, right, that this system might actually give me, right? And I think if you look at indie games, particularly, Tommy, I know you sort of touched on these indie games, but if you look at indie games, they're small budgets, right? And if you bring in AI systems, especially free open source stuff, their quality bar is going to get substantially raised, because the missing people that they cannot hire are now filled in by these generative AI systems. I was speaking to someone at GDC about, I can't remember his name, which is really embarrassing, but he was creating like an AI dungeons. You've probably heard of him, Tommy. Anyway, he's quite famous for this.
I did immediately think one of three people came into my head.
It's probably one of them.
Anyway.
Right? And I think that he's generating dungeons, right? And I think if you're a small company and you think, well, I want to do a dungeon keeper or a dungeon type of game, I can use that sort of the free part of it in order to generate some of my content. That would not have been accessible before this guy had created it, right? So it's enabling in many ways. I just thought I would throw that in there.
I would like to throw in there that we've got to keep in mind as well that the general perception of AI tools currently, generative AI tools in the public eye, is that those tools are free to use. And it's certainly not the case. It might also skew the perception in the industry that because they are free, widely accessible, that they are easy to use, that they are a bit of a panacea for all of their production problems. They're missing people, they're missing skill sets, and pretty much like a fast forward on experience. But they will probably find, like we have at Keywords recently, that the tools as they stand right now do not necessarily live up to their complete promise. And the cost of learning that might be high for a small team.
There's a lot to unpack there, just in that first question, and this is the trouble with AI. Like it's such a broad topic, and as you say, as you were saying, Tommy, it's not one that just goes back the last 2 years. It is one that goes back a long, long time. So just kind of digging into it and the implications of it is interesting when you've got a 45-minute session and we're already approaching the halfway mark. I kind of want to focus then a little bit more on the next. There's a lot there I do want to come back to, absolutely. But the next kind of step, I think, is I wanted to kind of talk about, as Sean was saying, like the automation of certain processes that are available that have been used in since the 80s. If you are a newer studio now, if you are a smaller or newer studio now, or if even you're a larger studio and you're still trying to work out, you're not perhaps using automations the way that you could, or AI, machine learning, all these different things that you could, where would you start? What advice would you have to people in terms of how best to use this? Which areas it's most useful for? I realise that's a lot of questions all in one, but I guess where to get started. If someone wants to look into using AI, machine learning, automation, all these things to kind of improve their development process, where would you suggest they start? Anyone?
I was going to say we do have two folk who work in QA, so that does seem like a natural fit.
I think, I'm coming into this with some degree of bias because we are a service providing studio. So Although we develop games as one half of the business pretty well, all of our other work is all client focused. And so for us, the easy business model is find an expert and go to a consultant or a service provider, and they can help guide you through that implementation. Exactly. But I think it is really, really difficult. And a lot of it is encapsulated into that enshittification, if you like, just to steal that word, of where parts of the industry appear to be, at least on the surface, going. Now, I would say some good candidates at a broad brush level are any area that you've got what you might refer to as traditionally generated content. So that might be, to Sean, NPCs, characters, all of those sorts of things. Perhaps when we're looking at roguelikes and genre spaces where you've got a lot of duplication, tree technology, all of those kind of assets, I'm sure there is a wide range of technology in those spaces that one could look to. For coding and engineering, certainly there's a number of tools now that didn't exist prior that are intended to help developers make progress more quickly through their development journey and identify problems early. So that's certainly a space. For us, much like Sean was talking about previously, a lot of what we do is attempting to look at the quality assurance process, which has a lot of rigor behind it. If you're dealing with any game of any scale, then you're dealing with sheets and sheets of test cases. You're relying on exact execution of these through a distributed team, reporting up the chain to make sure that regressions are caught early, all of those sorts of things. And that again is an area where you've got this repetition of work, where I think that can be a place where automation or AI can fit neatly into the puzzle. But that's at least our perspective through a very narrow lens, if you like.
Yeah. So,
Sean, do you want to pick?
Yeah. So what I was going to add to that is, I think that if you look at the systems of AI and then the chatter that goes on about AI, these small companies can start developing their own automation AI. Some of the things that Lauren's talking about. Verification that sits on top of CI systems, right? So when you're committing changes to the game, it can then go and verify a number of steps. Now, that's not necessarily AI, but we can certainly inject some AI in there, and we can certainly inject some automation of doing standard checks and then progressing those standard checks. And I think if you just look at the knowledge of where AI is going and the papers that they produce, it's easy for people to read it and reproduce it themselves, right? So especially indie developers, they can implement a lot of this stuff themselves. And I was going to go on to add, right, that for smaller companies, if we just focus on indie developers particularly, because I know funds are always tight, that things like this is where ChatGPT comes in, like for dialogue creators, right? So you can create a dialogue for your whole game through ChatGPT for nothing. You could use things like create discussions in it and then make it and then adapt it so that you can learn how to. I know there's some products out there, right? Like in World AI, they're kind of bringing this kind of ChatGPT type technology and feeding it directly into games. We have a few clients that are quite, they're into it. But I think mostly for indie games, it's about the learning that comes from this knowledge of these AI systems and automation. And I think AI sometimes equals automation. And I think that's where these indie developers will gain most of their stuff from, by creating this automation in their games. And therefore, they'll be able to it's about picking up the quality bug.
Someone else want to chip in?
One thing I would add to all this is critically just remembering, or actually taking a point to stop and think about what are the parts of your process that are quite mundane and quite monotonous, and I think we're talking about automation. Like, what are we automating? Find the things that we are kind of wasting them as a resource, and we can automate that part of the process. So, when we talk about QA, for example. Oh, a QA tester has to go and run into a door 500 times at 700 different angles to make sure you can't run through the door. Automate that. But things like, I need someone to go and do a quality pass through the level once every couple of days to make sure that all the UVs are correct and the textures are displaying correctly in the game and all the visual fidelity's there. That's something that we can do that with image recognition, certainly. But I think we can often do it much faster using a human, because that's a particular human skill set that we have that we can go in and immediately say, oh, that's not right. That's not right. I need to go and talk to an environment artist, a character artist, a prop artist straight away. And so it's all about thinking critically, what are the things that we can take away from from a human developer and automate that process and speed it up in ways that allows them to be more practical. So like I say, if we automate the walking into the door 10,000 times, they can be thinking about, well, I can maybe have 5 or 6 different automations running at once deployed onto a server, and that's part of my broader test strategy. Meanwhile, I'm also dealing with these more qualitative aspects. So breaking it up into kind of quantitative aspects of testing and qualitative parts of testing, and then where does the human element and where does our intelligence as creatives, can we utilize that, more effectively?
It's also about finding the right tool for the right purpose. Not all AI or automation tools out there are useful for for all the same usage. If you're trying to automate banging into the door, you might not use the same tool to create a repetitive meeting agenda, because you'll meet with your team every morning and you want to capture what people say. Definitely identify, like Tommy was saying, identify those areas that you do want to automate, and then do your research into what's available out there and use the right tool for the right purpose. There is no one silver bullet out there that will create your game for you. It does not exist yet. I'd be surprised if we see that in our lifetime.
Hopefully it never exists, right, Lucie, right?
Yep, I'm with you on that.
I kind of want to dig into some of that then. Inevitably with AI, the conversation always comes up, and we kind of touched on it in that opening massive debate with the first question, was the impact it has on human beings. Like Tommy, you're just saying there about work out which human resources are being wasted and can be replaced. So yeah, I can't imagine anyone's going to miss not running into a door 700 different angles. But there's an argument that some of the roles that, or some of the tasks that are being taken over by automation and AI and so forth, are perhaps taking away learning opportunities for new and junior talent. I've seen people talking, the example I've given is, if you have something like a Call of Duty or something and you use AI to generate all the gun models, well, someone will have been learning how to generate gun models. The example Sean gave about the dungeons, there's someone generating dungeons. Someone will have, prior to use of that tool, someone will have been learning how to create environments, how to design environments, how to make these work. With those learning opportunities gone, what impact does that have on how we train up the future workforce? Because the sort of tasks that people kind of hone their skills and learn the basics of, learn the fundamentals, and then go on to my kind of more creative tasks, those are in danger of being taken away from the sounds of it.
I don't think they necessarily are, because the dungeon still needs content, right, to randomly generate, right? It doesn't create it out of thin air, right? You've got your art style, you're building your models, you're building your textures and stuff, and you're feeding it in. It's just feeding it into a different system. So it's got the skill needs to still be there with building content, but you're just using it in a slightly different way that allows you to generate lots and lots of variation of it. And I think that's where AI systems really come in, is that if you want something in your game style, the AI system's not necessarily going to generate that, so you need to feed it something. So I think the same skills apply there. You build the thing and then you feed the system. Instead of building the whole thing, you're building it out of more building blocks. So there's a slight mindset change of how things get put together.
Do you think that there is a risk that has to be addressed to some extent, depending on the pipeline that you have? And actually, I realized this is probably something that Aleena, you could probably speak to better than I could in a moment. But if you're going to put a tool into your pipeline, understanding, particularly like you say, like this hierarchy, you have juniors, mid, seniors. You want to make sure that if a junior is using a particular tool, is that facilitating a part of the production process that's just onerous or time consuming to do? Or is it actually replacing a fundamental aspect of their skill set that their senior could do already? Because critically, speaking as someone who was a programmer day to day, like you learn an awful lot by having your seniors sit alongside you. I learned more in my first year as a software engineer in the industry just sitting next to my leads than I did in university. Not to say my university lecturers weren't great, speaking as a former programming lecturer, but you get my idea. And I think that's an important thing to understand is how is that. And I think also this is where good tools in the long run will actually survive in this space, because we're seeing a lot of AI tools emerge. A lot of them are going to disappear and die because fundamentally they don't really fit our practical needs. And I think this is something that is sitting in the back of people's heads, is that we need to make sure this tool isn't going to starve us of talent in the long run, because then the seniors all move on, they retire, or they decide they're going to get out of games and go and do something else. And then the juniors don't have the skill set to promote themselves into seniors because they kind of use these AI tools and automation tools as a crutch. So I think there's a balancing act that collectively we're going to have to still figure out in like the years to come.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that there are a lot of moving parts at play here. So on one hand, as Tommy just sort of fleshed out, definitely, in order to, just to take the analogy of writing, in order to at a high level understand how to put a book together, how to put a collection together, you really need to go down to the granular sentence level. And sure, some things you can sort of generate, but you need to be quite selective about it, right? You need to understand how the trees fit in together with the forest in order for the whole thing to run together. So I think that instead of like blindly or just jumping onto a bandwagon, I think that managers, and studios and the sector as a whole needs to be intentional as to what gets automated, not just in terms of whether it's easier for a machine to do it than a human, but what does it look like when you zoom out, right, to the sort of trajectory of a artist, of a writer, of a programmer, and so on. And these things are all very different. Video games are such a magical sort of product in that all these disciplines come together, right? Imagine how different a training for a games writer will be from a programmer. And whereas a programmer, is probably has a different idea of what the modular or granular aspects should be automated, a writer might have a very different idea. A person who's in game art, also has a different idea. I was at GDC, and at one of these roundtables, a games artist in a small company came and said, actually texturing is not it's not as mindless as you might imagine it to be. In fact, there's a lot of aspects of texturing that tell the story as well. So, whilst we may think, things like running into a door or or game testing, these things, there is consensus, right? But when it comes to more nuanced sort of processes that relate to assembling things, as it relates to more creative, quote unquote, creative processes, I don't think we are yet seeing a consensus as to what should and shouldn't be automated. And if I may, just one more thing in terms of the moving target is that as we saw with the automation of different processes that has already happened, when things become quote unquote less scarce, right, then what we start to see is that there is less attention to paid to it, within the social marketplace or within the cultural marketplace. So when trees started being automated, then it wasn't such a big deal anymore. Now as characters, hyper real characters are being automated, and as time goes on, it's not going to be a feature as well as much as it is sort of just part of the way games look now. Okay, so what's going to happen is that there's going to be a moving target as to what is deemed creative enough to not be automated, right? And what is sort of meat and potatoes, just let's just do this and focus on something else. And as a whole, how we appreciate games and what consumers look for, that's also a moving target. That's going to change with, right, the overall picture of automation. And I don't think that we can sort of put all the pieces in place right now, but certainly, we can have an idea of what games are going to look like at different levels as well, at the indie level, at the AAA level. What are consumers going to look for based on, for example, where does the human touch come in? Where does the creative spark or the aspect that makes people want to buy it? It's USP, for example.
Thank you, Aleena. I'm conscious that we're starting to run a little low on time, so I want to be a little bit more forward-looking now. And again, another kind of broad question. For you, where do you see the use of AI in games development specifically going in like the next, let's say 10 years, 10, 15 years? Like what, we've talked a lot about the processes that it's currently helping with or that it could help with, but like what do you see it becoming used for, like more in a more commonplace kind of way in the next 10, 15 years?
Well, I can certainly see it move into, and very much focus on what we're doing, right? Which is creating variation of game assets, especially from a content pipeline standpoint. Like Tommy's talking about, a lot of tasks that are mundane. But if you could have a single character and then you can then create a diverse population of a multitude of ethnicities, and you could bring that into your game very quickly, that's where I see it going, because it keeps the content creators creating, plus they get a wider content pipeline, i.e. it will bring much more variety into the game, make it more inclusive through these automation systems. Especially when we look at the product populate that we do, that's really what it's delivering. Is it's allowing the game developers to create a very small set of data that then can generate a ton of data from it and do all of those mundane tasks of refitting garments, recoloring skin, making new hairstyles. Is that you can supply it with like Lego bricks, and then the system can then create those characters from these Lego bricks. Now, I think you can move this kind of scenario across lots of things, and that means that it keeps the style of what the art wants to create, but through the content pipelines, it generates the variety that is usually missing, especially in low budget games. That's where I see it going.
I have an unconventional answer that I was maybe going to save for the end, but I'll kind of throw it out there. I think I agree with everything that Sean has just said, and I think that's a pretty neat bow. In terms of greater industry trends or where we're likely to see the technology deployed, I think inevitably local studio datasets is just going to become a thing. I think it will become part of most studios' infrastructure, is having a server that is just running local AI compute, be that large language models, diffusion, what have you. I think that's going to just be a way forward. I personally, though, I'm really curious to know how this affects the kind of marketplace and the consumer technologies that come with it. Now, I know that's not strictly game development, but I think under the broader umbrella, if you look at what has been occurring with supersampling technology across different vendors, I think that technology is going to find its way back into the development pipeline, and you'll start thinking upfront about, okay, if I'm producing this artistic experience, how will that be up-rendered or adjusted on the consumer end, on the player's side, to tighten that up. And I also think potentially the discovery process for content, for games that I might like to buy, is going to be very impacted as well. Beyond that, I think it's very hard to say. I do think, though, that we're probably going to exit this period of AI in the limelight for game development, and it will somewhat go back to just being a necessary technology to allow us to do our jobs. But yeah, it's an interesting moment right now.
I think there's two things that we should look out for, and that I'm currently thinking about. The first one, relates to at a higher level. Right now, we see an explosion, in different kinds of tools being coming onto the market, and also being experimented with. However, what we're going to see in a few years, as these sorts of companies consolidate, and as they start buying each other up, and as as the data becomes harder and harder and more expensive to wrangle with, is that there's going to be a hoovering up of all these different small tool sets into a larger, more consolidated one. Just as we've seen with digital content creation tools, the ecosystem is quite stable for different kinds of pipelines. So that's something that we should look out for, because what that means beyond efficiency towards things like creativity, and whether or not devs can do what they need to do to get the ideas out there, these kinds of expressive goals, is that there has been for many years a kind of criticism about homogenization, right, of the look and the feel of game. And the look and the feel of the game is actually really important. It's the key part of what gets your company, or what gets your studio recognition, but also what gives you personal joy. Okay, so that's on the one hand, and already we see throughout these range of at least creative facing tools for automation, is that there are a lot of different sorts of techniques that go beyond quote unquote generative AI. There's already what is called development by marketplace, by asset marketplace. That's a kind of automation, right? And also there's been sort of criticisms about how there is a aesthetic signature to tools like that are part of Unity, or even the MetaHuman creator. There's a sort of look, and we don't think about it right now, but actually customizing it to look to meet your own artistic goals. That's something that requires time, resources of time, but also resources of money, and it requires that you have a robust enough, studio data in order to augment these models, or to make them run, to be fit for purpose. So all these kinds of the question of deploying AI, generative AI specifically, within game development, it requires all these different sorts of issues that relate to not only what the tools look like, but also what kind of resources individual developers and studios more broadly have.
To go back to the original question about the future of the tools and how they are used, I do believe that the very immediate future is going to be one that questions the ethics and the legalities of those tools. That will help level the field and reduce the amount of tools available. I do believe that indie teams will have a leg up on large AAA studios, because they might not have as much structure already in place around particularly their legal challenges. It might be something that becomes the norm for them, but maybe it just also shakes up a little bit the established rules for the bigger players. Who knows which way it's going to go?
Yeah, I think first of all, I largely agree with everything that's been said, from talking about building and having internal models running within studios, like Lauren was saying, and using this as a mechanism for kind of ideation and iteration in games. I think that is going to become more commonplace. But also, I think critically, with Lucie and Aleena kind of pointed to this, a kneeling period that we're going to go through, a cooling off process, because we are rightfully asking the right questions. Like, is this the tool that we actually need? Is this impact? Is this ethical? Is this moral? What is the legal, or rather, we'll come to that, but what are the labor implications of this? Like, particularly right now, our industry is getting absolutely hammered with layoffs left, right, and center. I think this has been a really interesting, and I hate to say it given the current circumstance, but this couldn't have been the best time for AI to start popping up in this space as we are going through this horrible phase of layoffs, because we are rightfully critiquing it at this point and saying, look, this looks like it's trying to take over our jobs. And rightfully, what we are doing is pushing back against tools that we think, well, that's going to completely erase entire disciplines, when it really shouldn't, because we still require that human element. We need people to make games, right? Speaking as someone who's worked in this space for a long time, if an AI entirely makes a game, I have very little interest in playing it. Because if you like, it's like GPT. If you can't be bothered writing it, why should I read it? Like, I have zero interest in a book written by GPT. Like, James, you're good, man. You keep publishing your books, we'll keep reading them. So I think that's one part of it, is we are rightfully having these conversations about, is this the right tool for our purpose? And eventually we are going to reach a point where the right tools are going to, a lot of generative AI companies are going to fall off and die because they're spending hundreds of millions on AWS bills that they can't afford. And so subsequently, good tools are going to stabilize, they're going to mature, because also critically, they're talking with game developers who are saying, hey, that's a thing we actually could use, and those things will continue to develop. I think the one additional point to add to all of this is legal and regulatory frameworks are continuing to evolve quite drastically in this space. So right now, there's like the big question I still get from a lot of studios is this legal? And I go, shrug. Like, right now, the answer is probably not. The answer a year from now is, depending on what country or what continent you're on, it could be absolutely not. And so that's even going to be more interesting, where US is going one direction with copyright and adoption of AI systems in particular application areas. Then we've got markets in Asia that are going completely different directions. The EU is the only one that's actually came out and made a stand on this and said this is going to be the rule going forward. And particularly video games is a global business, right? So you're going to have to make sure that whatever tools you're building and systems you're building as part of your process are going to be compliant, such that the subsequent product you try to release is allowed in all the markets that you want to sell your game to. So I feel like right now we're going to go through this process of separating the wheat from the chaff, I think, in many regards, but also critically, we're just having to watch as to what is actually even going to be permissible in different markets across the world. So yeah, ending on a bum note. Sorry about that.
Thank you for that, Tommy. I would absolutely love to continue talking to the five of you for the next hour, but unfortunately we have come to the end of our time. So I want to say a huge thanks to the panel. Thank you so much for joining me on this. Thank you, dear viewer or listener or reader, however you're taking part of this discussion. Thank you so much for joining us. We will have more from GI Sprint in the coming days. The highlights of this session will be available on GamesIndustry.biz at some point in the near future. You can get more information on what we're doing around GI Sprint and more guides for how to make your games better, faster and cheaper if you head to GamesIndustry.biz. Thank you so much for joining us.